there's so much outrage, there's so much noise from all sides that people begin to just shut down. So either they're outraged or the people who aren't outraged just shut down, like, it's all a big mess. I don't want to hear it. But then they don't trust anyone. And this is something that worries me a great deal, because when outrage is everywhere, then the truly outrageous, it hides out in the crowd. The real outrages get lost in the shuffle.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm exploring the topic of the outrage industry. Who else here is growing inured to over-the-top tirades of outrage and offense? It seems to be, to me at least, a relatively new phenomenon whereby clickbait memes generating outrage are monetized by social media networks into clicks. And how does this impact society? If you'd like to find out, please listen in. And if you enjoy what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. I'd love to hear from you on my Facebook group, The Rational View. Richard Thompson Ford is a professor at Stanford Law School. He's written about law, social, and cultural issues and race relations for the New York Times, the Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, and Slate, and has appeared on the Colbert Report and the Rachel Maddow Show. He's the author of the New York Times notable books, The Race Card and Rights Gone Wrong, How Law Corrupts the Struggle for Equality. His latest book, Dress Codes, How the Laws of Fashion Made History, is now available. He lives in San Francisco. Richard, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get into law and all of your diverse interests here? This is quite a diverse bibliography.
Yes. Well, I went to law school right after my undergraduate degree and was interested in philosophy and social theory as well as law. I thought I would practice for most of my career, but instead I had the chance to do scholarly research. I was very interested in looking into things like the consequences of residential segregation on race relations, but also kind of big philosophical questions about the way we think about race and racial identity and whether the typical ways of thinking about that are healthy for a democracy, for members of minority racial groups, and for members of the majority. So I wanted to look at the way law affected all of those.
Okay.
And I guess that led me to look at law and culture. So most of my work in one way or another is about the relationship between law and everyday life, law and popular culture.
Interesting. So your latest book, Dress Codes, How the Laws of Fashion Made History, seems like a bit of a step out for a Stanford law professor. What inspired you to write about that?
Well, there are two things. The professional reason, well, one's professional and one's kind of personal. The professional reason is that I teach civil rights courses, I teach constitutional law, and I teach employment discrimination. And there are a lot of lawsuits about dress codes, a surprising number. And in teaching those cases to my students, I always found that the analysis offered by the courts was a little unsatisfying, mainly because the courts tended to begin with the presumption that clothing and dress is trivial and therefore not really worthy of legal attention. And the only reason we'd be concerned about it is if it touched on something more weighty, like, for instance, race discrimination, sex discrimination, or the clothing conveyed a message that was, comparable to something that could be written down in a treatise. And so the dress code was kind of a restriction on political speech. Those would be the ways they would look at it. But when you looked at the disputes more closely, it was pretty clear that the people involved cared about clothing in a different and maybe more complex way than the court was acknowledging. That there was a lot that was going on with why people cared about what they were wearing that wasn't captured in these cases. And I thought it would be worthwhile to try to dig into that. The personal reason is that, I'm interested in clothing and fashion. I find it important in my own life. And so I had kind of an intuitive sense that, what the courts were saying wasn't quite right. It matters to me what I wear. I think it's important for my, psychological well-being, but also for my professional status and my ability to do my job. And I think that's true for most people.
As an interesting aside, your cover art, there's a picture of Louis XIV showing off his legs with the leggings. I was just in Paris and I toured Versailles, and they were showing the portrait, and they said, yes, he was a ballet dancer, and he loved to show off his legs. So that was the reason that they have all these poses with his legs showing. So kind of an interesting thing. Does your book tie into that at all? Does it mention
Yes, it does. In fact, I was really happy when the publisher decided to select that, little fragment of the portrait of Louis XIV for the cover, because it kind of encapsulates a lot of what the book is about. It shows symbols of power. It's really clear that this is a powerful and important figure, even if you can't see the whole image. There's the fleur-de-lis, the velvet cloak, the ceremonial sword. But then you have these very feminine elements, or at least to modernize feminine, high-heeled red shoes and stockings and these shapely legs. And those aren't things that we associate with masculine power or status anymore, but they were then. So the symbols of power changed a lot over time. And in the book, I want to talk about the way clothing signifies power, status, membership in social groups, but also, and really critically, gender, and the way sex and gender intersect with those, and the way that's changed so dramatically over time. So for a world leader in the era of Louis XIV's to be vain about his legs was perfectly acceptable, probably even expected. But in today's environment, that would be seen as strange and maybe even disqualifying.
Indeed. Very interesting. I'm glad I asked about that. So I invited you to the show. I came across your eloquent essay online, The Outrage-Industrial Complex.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, and I was looking for someone who has investigated this and looked into this a little bit and is publishing on it. It seems like people today are competing to be the most outraged. I don't recall this to be a thing in my youth. I mean, sure, there were several outraged people, but they seemed to be outraged for good reasons. Segregation, equal rights, conscription, unjust wars. These days, it almost feels like people get outraged over anything, like white guys selling tacos. I think this cultural phenomenon is leading to some outrage fatigue amongst a lot of folks. How did we get here?
Well, I think there's several ways that we got here. One of the big ones, at least in the context of American politics, involves the decision by the American Supreme Court to eliminate campaign finance regulations. And, let me back up a little bit and explain why.
That's out of nowhere there.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear how
where
that
did that come from? But I think this is an important cause because in the 1990s, there was bipartisan agreement that we needed restrictions on money in politics. But the bipartisan compromise that was arrived at was struck down by the Supreme Court. So you have all this money flooding into politics. Now, what does that do? I think that the Supreme Court, when they made these decisions, thought that what it would do would be to unshackle wealthy people from restrictions on their ability to advance their point of view and affect elections. And they thought that that was related to values of free speech. That's the way the case is read. What I don't think anyone anticipated was that the ballooning of money in politics would lead to a whole industry, a huge multi-billion-dollar industry of full-time political consultants whose job it was to get people revved up about political issues. And so you have all this, but now what are they going to do? They're selling one product, one candidate, but they've got to get money flowing in, donations, and people engaged. If you're selling a product, you don't want to only sell it every 4 years when there's an election. You want to sell it all year, all the time. So you need to gin up political controversies to keep people engaged, keep people donating. And so you started to get, now that coincides, of course, with the rise of first the internet, text messaging, social media. So there are a lot of new ways to get that message out there. But, at least we now get, during an election season, 30, 40 text messages every day, telling us about some new outrage that's so important that we need to drop what we're doing and send in money to some political campaign. And this is true whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whatever, you're going to get these, you're going to get an email. Then the media is picked up on it. And so for clickbait, the more outrageous the headline, the more scandalous the claim, the more likely it is people are going to click on that link. And so it's really kind of poisoned our discourse generally. But I think the money is the key, that all of these political consultants, they need to keep their jobs. And they don't keep their jobs if people are calm and relaxed and rational and willing to wait for the month before the election to really start getting revved up. They keep their jobs if we're outraged and worried all the time.
Okay, fight the establishment. Watch The Rational View. I love it. So interesting. You think that the main driver of this is political contributions. So, I was definitely very aware of the impact of social media monetization of ad revenue, and how emotions are, lead to clickbait, lead to ads being generated. So that was the loop I thought was most responsible. But I like your insight into the political advertisement as another maybe parallel, maybe even a stronger means of generating this. We have the people that want this. Is there a link between the two things? Like, is the social media model based on the political lobbying issue? Or is
it may parallel? Just be that's a good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. It may just be a coincidence, that both happened at around the same time, because you have campaign finance struck down in the 1990s and the rise of super PACs and all the rest of it, and a lot of money flooding into political contests. And that's happening at the same time that social media is really revving up. Now, to be sure, social media plays an enormous role in that the algorithms for engagement are, the data has demonstrated that people are more likely to be engaged about negative information than positive information. I think it was either Facebook or Google, and I can't remember which one, they ran a study, and they found, people are much more likely to be engaged with negative information. So if an algorithm's just set up to push engagement, you're going to get a lot of negative information. And, the more negative, the better. So outrage is a natural outcome of all of that. And it's entirely possible that that's even more important than the political, the money in politics. Although during an election cycle like the one we've just gone through, it's hard not to notice just how much constant pestering we all get with negative information from paid political groups.
Indeed. Yeah. We saw that with Elon Musk on X, basically turning that entire platform into a constant political ad.
Exactly.
It was inundating. So, I mean, I don't entirely blame the people that set up the social media for this.
Mhm.
I would say that in the past, media has always made money with graphic fear mongering and ads,
Sure.
right? It's been
Mhm.
the coin of the realm for a long time, but at least there was a commitment to apolitical, fact-based reporting. And now that we have politically aligned news networks generating alternative facts for money, there seems to be, no way forward as a
Yes.
civilization in this model. We're stuck in this mess. Can we somehow regulate the media to be apolitical again? Is there a
Ah,
solution?
yeah, I mean, if only. I mean, there's another place where um, the current interpretations of the First Amendment make it very hard to implement regulations in this respect. So even dishonest, blatantly dishonest speech is generally protected speech. And I do think these things are all coming together in an interesting way. So, the money in politics, the rise of clearly ideologically skewed media like Fox News, the rise of social media, and a kind of ecosphere of ideologically siloed outrage are all coming together, so that a lot of people are only getting their information from these distorted sources, and then the legitimate media has to compete. So to some extent, the better legitimate media, the media that is still attempting to adhere to conventional standards of journalism, is being pushed in the direction of more sensationalist stuff, more outrage-based reporting, because they need to they need to compete for eyeballs with the extreme versions and the crackpots on YouTube and social media.
Yeah, and I've also found, because of the rise of social media, your standard newsprint media or whatever it is, they no longer can afford, the sort of journalistic budget that they used to have, where they would have investigative reporters that had a job to go and find news and
Right.
check facts. Now they're mostly confined to copying the newswire, and getting these short little news nuggets out. It really, I think, has affected the whole discussion that we have about politics, I think, as a society. I know
Yes.
a strong independent media is an important pillar of democracy that we kind of take for granted in our current situation. And we've had autocratic nations trying to destroy trust in the media. We have these alternative networks trying to destroy trust. They've been wildly successful. Trust is
Yes.
gone in the media. I don't know. Is there a path to regaining trust in the media as a society?
Well, I certainly hope so, because you're absolutely right to say that. I mean, and several things have happened. The old media model is in trouble, and so most of the conventional media outlets are barely profitable, if they're profitable at all. They can't afford to hire reporters. And, this is again skewing us toward the outrage side, even within the legitimate media, because it's cheaper to hire opinion columnists than it is to hire, to staff a newsroom of reporters that are actually gathering the facts. And so you're getting more and
Good
more
point.
opinion type news, and the line between editorial and straightforward news is a little blurrier, because so much of the news now, even in the first-rate newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post, is analysis. That's a new thing, and that started earlier. That started with CNN. So you had a situation in which everyone already knew the facts because they saw them on CNN first, before the New York Times could get their paper edition out. This is before the internet. And so what could the New York Times contribute to that conversation when everyone already knew the facts? Well, they could contribute analysis. But analysis, although at times it's great, is more likely to involve opinion, and bleed into something that is closer to editorializing than the straightforward who, what, where, when, why style of news that used to be the bread and butter And there, with a clear separation between that and opinion, with opinion being a really small part of what the newspaper does. Now it's like half of what they do.
Yeah, we kind of had we took the facts for granted for too long, I think, and now we've lost them.
Right.
You used in your essay Brett Kavanaugh's Senate confirmation hearing as an example of how outrage has become the more important than facts in
right.
interviews, in fact. And you said Kavanaugh and his handlers understood that this was no time for the kind of judicious temperament one would hope for in, well, a judge. What the emotional ritual demanded was an offering of outrage equal to that of Kavanaugh's accusers, a demonstration not of his objective innocence, but of his subjective fury at his accusers.
Mm-hmm.
How do we accept that as on par with rational, evidence-based facts?
Yeah, we have moved to a point where the theater of politics is what carries the day. It was, and that confirmation hearing was a striking example of it because of how, red-faced and angry Justice Kavanaugh was. I can't believe that he wasn't coached to do that. Sure. I very strongly suspect that was a strategy to try to counterbalance the outrageousness of the accusations, the outrage that would be generated by the accusations against him. And the idea was, people will see his authentic rage and believe that he's innocent, rather than looking at the facts and having an investigation. And, frankly, it worked.
Emotions have become par with evidence, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
That's very clear. And I don't know how a society can move forward when we debase rationality and reasoning as the basis for making judgments. I mean, that's why I put this podcast together, is to fight against that. But how does that become acceptable? Can people not see through this?
Apparently not. Now, here's the thing, though. I think sometimes people see through it, but the consequence is not desirable, because what happens is there's so much outrage, there's so much noise from all sides that people begin to just shut down. So either they're outraged, or the people who aren't outraged just shut down. Like, it's all a big mess. I don't want to hear it. But then they don't trust anyone. And so and this is something that worries me a great deal, because when outrage is everywhere, then the truly outrageous hides out in the crowd. And people say, everyone's always saying that, we're going to hell in a handbasket. You heard that around Donald Trump, that people who voted for Donald Trump and who were asked, aren't you worried that a significant number of people who work for him say that he's not fit to lead? They say he's a fascist. They say that he'll, undermine democratic norms. And the people said, that's always what the opposition says. He wasn't that bad last time. He probably won't be that bad this time. So, rather than look at the evidence, they just had kind of a general sense that, you can't really trust anything that's out there. So I'm going to go with my gut. And so, again, we're being pushed away from something that's evidence-based. But it is true that the proliferation of outrage on all sides, and again, then I'd go back to money and politics, that this is the way a professional, class of political advertisers has to do their job. That's what keeps them in business 7 days a week, all year round, rather than just during the election season.
Keeps the money flowing.
And there's, you hear enough of that the real outrages get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been one mistake in the response to the circus of outrage, I guess, that accompanied the last Trump administration, and certainly the impeachments and the trials and all this stuff. Like, it seems like they treated everything equally as outrageous. And it's like, okay, let's prosecute him on these things, but we never prosecuted him on the coup attempt. He was never prosecuted on putting forward a slate of false electors. Like,
right.
I was waiting for that shoe to drop, but they got caught up in all the outrage at everything else that seemed to be not as important.
Yeah.
I think certainly it was important, but there's a scale here.
Right. There was a sense in which, part of this is just a function of the legal system and which charges could be brought readily. So the most serious charges got bogged down, in part because they got assigned to bad judges that deliberately bogged them down, to be quite honest. And the less serious charges, although, as you say, still serious, were the ones that could move ahead. And then I do think that you had a lot of people who said, well, look, they're going to go after him for anything. They say he's a fascist and he's going to burn down democracy, but they're going after him for, paying hush money to a porn star. How can we really believe he's as bad as they say if that's all they've got?
Yeah. It seemed, I don't know. Here we are.
Right. So here we are.
There's this industrial outrage complex, as you call it, based on bringing in money into political lobbyists to support the oligarchy that we've put ourselves into. What advice do you give your students on how to fight back against this industrial outrage complex?
Well, I'd say several things. One is tune as much of it out as you can. I think that a lot of people feel, a lot of the most engaged and civic-minded people feel that they have an obligation to tune into all of this, to make sure that they're up to date on the latest outrages as responsible citizens. And I would say that's not true. That what we have instead, we have a responsibility to try to navigate this kind of cesspool of outrage and manufactured scandal, and zero in on the things that are really important. And that means a lot less outrage, but outrage at the right things at the right time. The other thing I'd say is that I don't think we should give up on campaign finance reform. There's certainly not much prospect that we're going to have the unfortunate decisions of earlier Supreme Courts overturned by this Supreme Court. But in the long run, some way of getting money back out of politics so that we can have a sensible short election season rather than a perpetual election season, where we can have a focus on the facts and legitimate policy debate and less of the noise. I think we need that for a healthy democracy, and it's too important to just give up on.
It's definitely become theater rather than facts, and that's a problem if you want your policies based on rational thought rather than
yes.
Popularity. Unfortunately, we're heading towards a bread and circuses type of regime, I think. More towards the circuses than the bread.
Right.
So yeah, very, very interesting. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to give us on what you think we should be focusing on, or where we're going? Is there hope?
Is there hope? I like to believe that there's always hope. There are a few things that we could focus on. I mean, one is consumers do have power if they create movements. And so, for instance, with respect to social media, we're ultimately in charge. Now, we can be manipulated by social media algorithms into going down, the toilet of outrage, or we can push back and try to organize, to resist, and to push these social media companies to change their algorithms to do something different, to quit clicking on the next link with the newest outrageous story, to educate yourself about what stories are plausible and which ones aren't. I think that that's a responsibility of anyone in a democracy, and that kind of stuff can change. I mean, these algorithms do respond to what you do. A little aside, everyone was complaining about the terrible media feeds that people would get on TikTok, and how they fed all sorts of misinformation and things like that. My daughter is on TikTok a lot, and she would say, I don't understand what they're talking about. My TikTok feed doesn't have any of that. It only has videos of dances and positive messages. And I would say, yes, sweetheart, but that's because it's your feed and you are clicking on links that are leading you to that. Other people's TikTok looks really different. So, we do have some control over this if we're willing to act, kind of strategically about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand what you're saying. And one of the things that, the way it affects me is like, I have a presence on Twitter, X. I have a certain number of followers that I've worked up over the years, but now, Elon Musk has been using it for misinformation and political advertising now. A lot of people are moving to other platforms, but what that's doing is further reinforcing the siloing. I don't want to just abandon this, right? I want to be able, I think part of the work that needs to be done is to provide a counterpoint into these silos and break these silos, right? The silos are what's causing polarization in a way, and hearing rational viewpoints from what might be considered the other reality is helpful, I think, in cracking against that. So I don't, I would love to just walk off of that platform and in response, but I also feel like I'm running from a fight, kind of thing.
Right. That's an interesting point, because I do know a lot of people who have abandoned X for just this reason. In part in order to perhaps punish Elon Musk, although I don't know how much effect that's going to have given the amount of money he has, but also because they just don't want to be mixed up with this kind of this cesspool of misinformation. But it's a good point that we really need fewer silos, and we need to break through to people who are unlikely to agree with us in any way we can, in platforms that are going to at least give some chance of a reasonable conversation or a reasonable debate.
Yeah, good analysis. And thank you for the interesting point on campaign finance driving some of this outrage. I hadn't realized that particular link. So learn something new every other day anyways. So thank you, Richard Ford, for coming on The Rational View. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This has been a great conversation.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.